right, let's bring on our roundtable for today. Good to have with us Jill Alper from Alper Strategies, Steve Mitchell, pollster and analyst from Mitchell Research, Nolan Fenley, editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and Chastity Pratt, Detroit-based reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And Chastity, let me start with you. You have written and talked a lot about what happened in Flint. 9 state officials now caught up in charges. What was your reaction as you started to look at the charges and the breadth of them?
Well, I'm not a reporter anymore. I'm an editor.
Well, yes, sorry.
But I mean, this idea that the charges would have been different under Schuette, I don't know about that. He was Republican. He was in there during some of the time all this was happening. I don't know if those charges would have been worse. There's a lot here. And in the end, and ultimately, I think people in Flint have been waiting a long time for this. We have, the biggest issue in Flint is trust in government. This destroyed the trust in government in Flint. And people have been waiting, 7 years, since they first started shaking those bottles of brown water at the state saying, look, do something about this. So there's going to be a lot that people are looking at to say whether to charge a stick or not, how hard the state goes after them. People are looking to see, is something going to happen that's going to restore Flint's trust in government?
Yeah. Steve Mitchell, let me get your take on what we saw. It was interesting looking at the faces in the mugshots, the court appearances, which happened by video on Thursday. Clearly, a lot of people there that never, ever expected to be on that side of the courtroom.
I think that there was a very interesting comment made to Bridge Magazine back in November of 2018. And it's, quote, "I have long been a critic of the way in which Bill Schuette has handled the Flint water crisis investigation. He is merely an opportunist who has used the crisis to further his political ambitions by a series of politically charged show trials. The entire process has been highly suspect." That quote is from Dana Nessel from 2018. I mean, I think when you start charging public officials for making decisions as a part of the way they do their work, never intending to be doing anything criminal when they make those decisions, you're really crossing a barrier that should not be crossed. What happens if the Enbridge line closes up and somebody freezes up in the Upper Peninsula to death? Are they going to go after Dana Nessel because she was responsible for shutting it down? I just think this is an egregious attempt to charge individuals. You look at what they've done and how well they responded to this. There was never any criminal intent involved in any of this, and I just find it outrageous.
Nolan Fenley, your thoughts? Was there intent is one thing, but we're talking about perjury, people who knew better than to say some of the things that they said, and a record that seems to suggest that people knew things before they admitted they did.
I don't know. These charges very seriously. Obviously, I think they risk criminalizing public service, but we don't yet have much information about the background surrounding these charges. They were issued with an unusually small amount of information, but I would agree with Steve, and more relevant and closer is the fact that I think it leaves Governor Whitmer vulnerable to charges, and I write that this morning, leaves her vulnerable to being charged in her handling of the COVID-19 crisis, because a lot of people died in nursing homes with people advising the governor, begging the governor to change her policies. Now, I don't think the governor acted with ill intent there. I don't think Snyder acted with ill intent. They might both have got something wrong. That should not expose you to criminal charges as a public official.
Jill, people have wondered over the years about charging people for the way that they carry out their public office duties could have a chilling effect on obviously the people who decide whether or not they want to run for office. But I'm trying to imagine the people of Flint, if there weren't charges filed, the way that they would have felt. This would have been, I think many of them would have felt very aggrieved and forgotten.
Right. Well, it's very nuanced. It's very complicated, and I'm sure there are many layers to this onion. It would give, I think, anybody serious pause about wanting to serve with this kind of responsibility. But there is an accountability that goes along with being in the chair. So the questions need to be asked. The information eventually needs to be shared. It needs to see the light of day, and people need to be held to account. If there were things that were done that were egregious, I do agree. I don't think anybody involved had malicious intent to harm people. Though people died, actions were or weren't taken, and soon enough, I think we'll learn the truth. And for the community of Flint to heal, all of this has to be on the table, unearthed, discussed, and justice must be brought. The Attorney General, I believe, and the prosecutors are going to play this by the book.
Kevin, if I may, justice doesn't always mean sticking somebody in jail.
Sure.
I agree that the people of Flint need to be compensated for the damages they suffered. They need to be made whole. But that doesn't necessarily mean destroying another group of people, dragging them through the courts and sticking them in jail.
Nolan, let me let Chastity jump in there because I want to move on to the next topic here real quick. But go ahead, Chastity.
I think the one question that people want to see come out in this court case is, what did they know and when did they know it, right? Not so much, intent, but there's, the question of, did Rich Baird, who is a native of Flint, did he lie to investigators during the whole process of fact finding? And did the governor and his advisors know that the water was bad well before they told the people of Flint? What did they know and when did they know it?
Yeah. All right, I want to quickly move on. We've only got about 4 minutes left, which leaves about a minute for each of you to give me your take on the State of the Union as we're now 3 days away from the inauguration of Joe Biden. And Steve Mitchell, let me start with you. What is the state of the United States right now?
We are deeply divided by a 4% margin. Joe Biden won. That division is the same today as it was, despite everything that occurred on January 6th. Let me share some poll data from YouGov and Economist magazine. How much confidence do you have that the 2020 election was held fairly? Trump voters, 60%, none at all. 21%, only a little. How much voter fraud do you think occurred in this election? Among Trump voters, 71%, a lot. 25%, a little. That's 96%. You think that voter fraud changed the results in some of the states? Enough fraud to change who won the election? 84% of Trump voters believe that, and 57% of independents believe that. You think Trump ought to resign? 10% of Trump voters, 90% of Biden voters, but by a split 43 to 43%, independents are tied. You think President Trump should be removed from office? 5% of the Trump voters believe that, 93% of the Biden voters, and 43 to 47 independents. And finally, here we are in the poll conducted 4 days after the problems in Washington, D.C. What is Trump's job approval among Trump voters? 49% strongly approve, 34% approve somewhat. That's 83% of Trump voters, despite everything that's happened, still approve of the job he's doing.
Paints a picture,
divided.
Paints a picture of a deeply divided nation. Jill, how about you?
Right. I think the country is divided for sure. We see that in the data. We also see, though, that a lot of Americans do not approve of what took place in the last week. And we're hoping for everybody, when the clock struck 2021 for a new day. Joe Biden stood up yesterday, stood up to give an eloquent speech about the future, about wresting COVID and improving our economy. And I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that we're going to turn the page. Now, there still is a question about the impeachment of the president, and it seems like the Senate is still sorting its way forward in terms of process. So there's going to be more pain ahead. But the most important thing I think Americans are feeling is the importance of restoring our democracy and for people being held accountable when they're out of line, not respecting the rule of law, our elections, and the way a constructive society works. So we're polarized, but hopeful.
Nolan and Chastity, I'm just about out of time. You guys get the short end of the stick, but I want to let you both weigh in. Nolan, you first, quickly.
Well, I'd echo Steve. Trump leaves office among a certain percentage of the population, a large percentage, one of the most despised president in history, and among a significant portion of the population, one of the most beloved. And that's where we are.
That really says a lot. And Chastity, you get the last word.
So my question is this Million Militia March going to cause a big kerfluffle, or a big, siege or whatever during the inauguration? In the end, and ultimately, the United States is supposed to be this beacon of democracy, and the question remains, we've always been polarized, always, 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 but is that going to continue to show itself on the world stage? Are we going to continue to see our democracy fray and fray and fray publicly? And, or will we see our national leaders now and moving forward stand up, get along in some way that shows the rest of the world that we can protect democracy and move on?
And that's where we stand this morning. Thanks so much, gang. I got to leave it there. I got to get to a break. Thanks for the time. Back with more in just a minute.